stoked. The Hungarian Heritage Podcast is back for Season 3, and we are Hungarian Heritage stronger than ever. For those of you who have been here a while, welcome back, and thanks so much for sticking around. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so happy that you're joining us. My name is Christine, and I'm the host here at the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. During Season 3, I will continue to bring you guests and topics that celebrate Hungarian culture, people, and food. And of course, we will feature all of the cool things that Hungarians are doing around the world. Together, we will discover new things and review things that you may already know. And most of all, we will have a lot of fun along the way. One episode at a time, we will build those bridges between Hungarians who live in Hungary to those who live in other parts of the world. Not to mention the bridges we will build between the generations. So, if you're looking to make that first connection to your Hungarian heritage, or you're looking to strengthen your connection, then you found the right place. Join me, and together we will connect your modern lives to your Hungarian heritage by expanding this Hungarian heritage community and making the circles of Hungarians around us Hungarian heritage strong. Welcome to this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. I am thrilled to welcome back Dr. Anna Fenyvesi. As many of you know, Anna has been my guest on an episode when we discussed her role as co-editor of the Hungarian Roots and American Dreams book, and she has also co-hosted episodes with me as we celebrated Hungarian Heritage Together when we interviewed contributing authors and their stories that were included in Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. On this episode of the podcast, Dr. Anna Fenyvesi is here in her professional role as a sociolinguist. And on today's episode, she will discuss her research as a Fulbright Scholar that she recently completed at the University of West Virginia, where she studied the linguistic heritage of American Hungarians in Appalachia. We discuss how Americans use and speak the Hungarian language outside of Hungary, how we establish our social relationships through language, and what factors affect language integration. Not only that, we also talk about Anna's cemetery visits and the interviews she conducted with Hungarian descendants in the Appalachian region. I am sure that you will enjoy this episode because you will be able to make so many connections to your Hungarian relatives that emigrated from Hungary to other places in the world. Please join me in welcoming back to the podcast Dr. Anna Fenyvesi. Today, Dr. Anna Fenyvesi has returned to the podcast in her official role as a professor and director of English and Applied Linguistics at the University of Szeged in Hungary. She is here to discuss her recent Fulbright research at the University of West Virginia titled The Appalachian Hungarian Heritage Project, the Sociolinguistics of Heritage Hungarian. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me today to discuss your research.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's really great to be back. I'm very excited to be back. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to hear more about this research. You know, I live on the East Coast, so, Appalachia and, the Appalachian, region is more familiar to maybe me as someone that lives on the East Coast. I have Hungarian, so the connection of those two things. I'm definitely very interested in hearing about your research, but I think it's important to define some of the things we're going to be talking about in this episode. So before we even do that, can you give the listeners a little bit of your background? Tell us about your position and your work at the University of Szeged, because that's what led you to this research. So give us a brief introduction to your CV.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I graduated from the University of Szeged back in the late 1980s. Majoring in English and Russian, and I was always more interested in my English studies than my Russian studies for various reasons. And then soon after the change of regime in Hungary, when travel restrictions, were eased and it was possible to travel, I decided that I wanted to study in the United States and do my graduate degrees here. And so in 1991, I spent a year applying to graduate programs, and I was admitted to the linguistics department of the University of Pittsburgh as a grad student. And I earned my master's degree and then later my PhD at the linguistics department. And so basically, being in Pittsburgh made me a linguist. And even though I had applied to several programs, I mean, that Pittsburgh was the only one that gave me a full scholarship. So it was sort of the decision
Sure.
was basically made for me. But that was a really, really great coincidence or fact that I ended up in Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh at the time had lots of Hungarian communities all around it in small towns in
Hmm.
southwestern Pennsylvania, like in Beaver Falls and McKeesport, and in Pittsburgh itself there were several functioning Hungarian churches. And so as a grad student, I met a lot of people from the Hungarian community there and started going to their events. Fun fact, I attended a grape harvest dance for the first time in my life in Pittsburgh because where I grew up in Hungary on a new development, there were no grape harvest dances.
Hmm. Yeah, I do recall my grandmother telling me about grape harvest dances and things as that such because she grew up in a little bit more of a rural area. So that's pretty exciting
Yeah,
and ironic
yeah.
that you got to do that here in the US.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. And so I met lots of American Hungarians and it was a very interesting cultural scene for me. I mean, they spoke differently, spoke Hungarian differently. They were sort of definitely different kind of Hungarians that I had been meeting in Hungary until then. And being a linguist, I was especially interested in the way they spoke English and also Hungarian. And so I ended up doing my master's thesis on the Hungarian language use of the Hungarian community in McKeesport, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And then my PhD dissertation was on something else. But basically, studying American Hungarian language use was my first linguistics topic that I ever studied, and it was always very close to my heart. In the early 2000s, I wrote a big chapter about Hungarian in the United States in a book that I edited about the varieties of Hungarian outside Hungary. And that was a big book published by John Benjamin's publisher, which was a big academic publisher. And so it talked about the varieties of Hungarian spoken in Slovakia, Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, Slovenia, Austria, and then two overseas varieties, Hungarian in the US and Hungarian in Australia. And I wrote the US chapter. And then, for most of the 2010s, I was working on other topics. And then finally, a year and a half ago, I decided to submit a Fulbright application to come to the U.S. and do some more work on American
Right.
Hungarians. And by this time, my kids had grown up, and I didn't have to 24
Yeah.
7.
Yeah, I feel like it's like our 2.0, we get to
Exactly,
we live a
exactly.
different,
Yeah.
not necessarily better, just different. We get to do more things that maybe we weren't able to accomplish, even though everything that you've told us already are amazing accomplishments. And I find that because I was around Hungarian speaking people in my family, and I know I've mentioned this in other episodes, probably the episode that we recorded about the book, I always paid attention to pronunciations of things. And then
Hmm.
I guess that just, moved forward in me being able to learn Spanish as a second language much
Hmm.
easier because I
Absolutely.
heard a lot of different sounds that maybe other people weren't hearing in their home. And then just my interest in pronunciation,
Hmm.
which is specifically linguistic. So before we move forward, I feel like it's important to maybe define the difference between linguistics and sociolinguistics because they are part of a similar definition, but one is like a subset of the other. So because you're the
Exactly.
expert and I'm just commentating on my own life experience, I'm going to let you define the difference and what those two words are.
Yeah, so linguistics basically is the science of dealing with language and
Hmm.
the most strictly speaking, I mean, linguistics can be understood as theoretical linguistics, which deals with
Mhm.
the phonology, that is the sound system,
Right.
morphology, the parts of words or
Hmm.
syntax, the sentences, and the semantics, the meanings of words and sentences. And so these give you the core of linguistics. If you want to know something about a language, you have to tackle these areas.
Right.
But then, in addition to that, there's a whole lot of other branches of linguistics, like
Right.
historical linguistics that
Hmm.
deals with, obviously the histories of languages, or sociolinguistics, or psycholinguistics, or cognitive linguistics. I mean, there is a whole big list of,
Right.
of
Sure.
various subfields. But sociolinguistics, as the name suggests, is sort of on the crossroads of society and linguistics.
Right.
And sociolinguists look at language as a social phenomenon that we use not just to communicate with others, but through which we basically talk about the world, talk about society, talk to each other, establish our relationships. I mean, if you
Right.
think about conversation, I mean, we don't just speak to each other to relay meanings and relay messages, but we maintain and also establish our social relationships through language. And that's how sociolinguists look at the world and
Right.
language in it. That what do we do to do that?
Exactly. And I feel like I'm not going to lie, I did look up some specific definitions, even though I'm a former English teacher, and I also dealt with grammar and things as such. So linguistics, what I'm hearing and what you're saying, it's for those of you listening who might not have an English background or have ever heard of sociolinguistics. Linguistics is pronunciation, the grammar, and like putting sentences together. Or even I remember a class I had in college a thousand years ago when you pronounce words, like where your tongue is placed in your mouth when you
Exactly.
speak a word. And for those of you listening out there, I know you're all looking at social media as well. There are a lot of linguists out there who will say a sentence and they'll say it in different dialects. And that has to do with tongue placement and pronunciation. So I know that's getting a little technical, but linguistics, and sociolinguistics, I guess in the layman's terms of what you're saying, has to do with regions. So you're taking like how you're pronouncing and the word you're saying, and how does that relate to the regions of where you live, class, gender, and those were some textbook definitions that I pulled off of the internet, not my specific
Right.
definitions. Because
Mhm.
if we use the United States per se as an example, one of the questions I always funny questions I get when I'm speaking to some of my friends or even family members in Hungary, they'll say, how do people from this region sound and or this region, and I'll speak in a like accent from people from
Mhm.
Texas or people in California, and that's the socio linguistics. That's one like little example of what you're speaking of. Just
Absolutely. Yeah.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
So your Fulbright research that brought you to the University of West Virginia, and you were there for approximately 5 or 6 months, correct?
Yes, I've been here since August at
Okay.
West Virginia University, and I have been based actually with the history department because,
Okay.
well, for several reasons. The colleagues I'm working with on the Appalachian Hungarian Heritage Project are historians because
Okay.
they're interested in the history of Hungarians in the Appalachian region. But also, currently, there is no linguistics department at WVU anymore
Okay.
for
Right.
various reasons.
Now, what inspired you? Obviously, this is like your life's work, but what specifically brought you to want to study this specific topic of the Appalachian Hungarian Heritage Project and the sociolinguistics of that?
Well, I really wanted to come back to this first topic that I ever worked on as a linguist, the
Hmm.
American Hungarians in one shape or form. But I also realized that in the past 30 years, since I've first studied it, the American Hungarian scene in Appalachia changed very drastically because even if you look at the Pittsburgh area, where there used to be many, many living communities of Hungarian speakers, not just
Mhm.
American Hungarian descendants, but Hungarian speakers, those communities are really gone by now,
Mhm.
at least the older communities,
Yeah.
because people passed away. The younger people moved away from the area because of the collapse of the end of the steel mills and the factories, and even earlier the collapse of the coal mining on a large scale that used to be. So I knew that this would not be possible to actually study the language use of American Hungarians. So I thought, okay, well, the next best thing would be to look at the linguistic heritage. And as a sociolinguist, two ways of studying the linguistic heritage that made sense to me were what I proposed in my Fulbright application. And one of those things is looking at the linguistic landscape of American Hungarian cemeteries. And the other thing is doing live narrative interviews with the descendants of American Hungarian or Hungarian immigrants to the United States in English, bearing in mind that
Right.
very few of these people actually know any Hungarian at all anymore.
Okay. Well, that's pretty fascinating. I know that there are definitely many people that are fascinated on the surface level with cemeteries. And I
Hmm.
know it's not necessarily something that people look to as a positive thing to be interested in. But there's so much that can be learned from a cemetery, history, um,
Exactly.
influxes of immigration over time and as in relation to present day. So that's pretty exciting. And also you've done interviews with the descendants of these people. So I'm going to let you take it from here and just tell us about this research so that I don't interrupt with any questions that aren't as relevant. So tell us about your research and what you've learned.
Yeah, so before I actually tell you about the cemeteries and then the life narrative interviews, I want to just do a very, very brief introduction to the way a sociolinguist looks at a situation like this. Hungarian immigrants
Right.
came to the United States, and then what happened in the next several generations from the linguistic point of view. And I'm sure
Okay.
that I will be talking about things that your listeners know from their own experience. I mean, if they are listening to this podcast in English and they are interested in my Hungarian heritage,
Yeah.
then they have some interest in Hungarian and presumably they have seen what I'm going to talk about with their own eyes. So basically, for the sociolinguist, what happens to the descendants of immigrants is language maintenance or language shift. And this is the big dichotomy for a sociolinguist
Right.
because the Hungarians came to this country, they did not speak any English, they learned some English, and then their children, basically who grew up in the United States, they learned Hungarian at home, they learned English in schools, and most of them became pretty much native speakers of English who knew some Hungarian, maybe more, maybe less Hungarian, but some Hungarian. And then the third generation basically are full-blown English speakers
Mm,
who might or might not know just a tiny bit of Hungarian.
right.
Now, this process, that plays out in the course of typically three generations in the United States is language shift. That is,
Okay.
a minority language basically loses grounds in the community and gives way to the majority language, English. And to the sociolinguist, it's always interesting to see when you study a bilingual community, what are the factors that affect this process from one side or the other. That is, what are the factors that help language maintenance and support language maintenance, and what are the factors that drive communities towards language shift.
Okay.
And I mean, the probably the biggest factor is whether the bilingual community you are talking about is an immigrant community or a non-immigrant community. And I can
Okay.
give you, I mean, a contrast, especially in terms of Hungarians out in the world, would be the Hungarians in countries neighboring Hungary who are
Right.
typically bilingual these days. In
Right.
Romania, they speak Romanian and Hungarian. In Slovakia, they speak Hungarian and Slovak. In Serbia, they speak Serbian and Hungarian. Versus the immigrant communities in the United States. Well, if you look at the language shift and language maintenance in countries neighboring Hungary, what you see is that even though these Hungarians became citizens of other countries more than 100 years ago, after the Treaty of Trianon,
Right.
which redrew the Hungarian borders after the First World War,
Right.
uh, the language maintenance is luckily still there, and even though there is some language shift, that is some of the descendants of Hungarians are becoming Serbian speakers, typically, in Serbia, typically if they marry Serbian speakers
Right. Right.
and then start speaking Serbian at home. But there are still hundreds of thousands of Hungarian speakers in Serbia and Slovakia, over 1 million of them in Romania. So the situation is very different. And what is so sort of sociologically different is that their communities have remained there intact. And even though the
Right.
official language changed over their heads, and maybe the administration of those countries, started using another language, but their communities remained.
Right. Well, it makes sense because the United States is made up of so many. And say neighboring countries of Hungary, they can maintain their language because they're really maintaining a language by learning. Then there's only one other language for the most part in the country. But when you come to the US, we're a country of so many languages, so many heritages. And I do have to say that like over time, I imagine, I haven't like researched this historically, but just from, my life's experience, I feel like the US probably demanded historically that people learned English because of there were so many different heritages. It wasn't just like we had one native language here of English, and we're just made up of so many. So that shift of what you're talking about, you lose it a lot faster here than you would in a neighboring country of Hungary. And a factor too is, at least concerning myself, is that my dad, who was born in Hungary, came to the US as like an 8 or 9 year old, but then didn't marry a Hungarian.
Right,
So that's
right.
another shift,
Mhm,
I imagine, that
mhm.
affects the maintenance of the Hungarian language. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. You're
And I
spot
and I,
on.
I feel like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I feel
Mhm.
as though so many people out there listening can feel that, whether it's their generation or like their parents' generation, they're experiencing exactly what you've explained. So I feel
Right.
like it's a big connection there.
Right. So in addition to, this big difference whether a minority group is immigrant or non-immigrant, I mean, that's probably the biggest factor. But within the US, I mean, if you think about it, immigration to the US has always been voluntary. That is, people chose to
Right.
come here,
Hmm.
and then they wanted better lives for their children. Well,
Sure.
socially, what does that translate into? Well, you want good education and good jobs for your children. Well, that means, education in English speaking schools and
Right.
then universities, hopefully, and then jobs in English speaking workplaces. And this is the economic incentive for people to actually use more and more English in their lives. That is, you want a better life. Yeah, well, you have to be fluent in English. You have
Of
to
course.
do your education in English and then get a job speaking in English. So the economic motive is definitely
Right.
there. Then other factors, from the perspective of from sociolinguistics, is the demographic factors. How big is the
Hmm.
community, and not just the absolute numbers, but also the relative numbers. That is there a Hungarian neighborhood, for instance? Because in all those places where people formed neighborhoods, and I know from the people I interviewed in the 1990s about McKeesport that in McKeesport there were like uh, thousands and thousands of Hungarians, and even some African Americans spoke Hungarian, a little bit of Hungarian,
Wow.
because there were so many Hungarian immigrants. In that kind of setting, it was much easier to maintain the language and to teach it to the kids who were already born in the US than, for instance, if people had settled somewhere where there was no Hungarian community.
Right.
And that is one big difference between the old-timer immigrants that came at the
Yeah.
beginning of
No,
the 20th
yeah.
century
Yeah.
versus later the DPs who came after the Second World War, or some of the 56ers, the 50, the people with working class backgrounds from the 1956er generations were the ones who typically settled in the communities in these working class towns. And
Right.
then the professionals went where the good jobs were, and they did not necessarily find a Hungarian community there. Well, this usually affected their language shift or language maintenance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
feel like that your study specifically in the Appalachian region could probably be shifted to a lot of other areas in the US
Oh,
in
absolutely.
similar
Yeah.
communities. So anybody out
Yeah.
there listening and wherever they're from, they could probably make the connection to what you're presenting here with your research.
Yeah, and I want to mention three more factors.
Yeah.
One is the difference, especially in the US, between urban and rural communities. Okay,
Okay.
all of the Hungarian communities that formed in the formerly industrial regions of the US south of the Great Lakes, they were industrial towns, so basically urban communities where
Okay.
people basically went where the good jobs were or where a better job existed, and there was a lot of mobility, geographically speaking, from job to job, town to town, and then of course people settled. But urban communities are much less stable than rural communities are. And there's a nice example for in the US for that. If you
Okay.
think about the rural community of Hungarians in Hammond, Louisiana, which used to
Okay.
be called Árpádhon, Louisiana.
Okay.
That's a place which was founded by Hungarian settlers in the early 20th century. So by 1907, there was several families living there, and they became farmers. They became strawberry farmers
Hmm.
and had a thriving community that was in the 1970s was still, they had folk dance groups, they had choirs, they had this very vibrant community life. Well, the difference is very stark between that and other places. And one of the reasons is that they were farmers, and
Hmm.
farming communities are much more stable because, once
Right.
people work the land, they don't move around. And
Right. Right.
um,
And
and
I feel like I've heard of this term, third places or third spaces,
hmm,
where people have the opportunity to see people like
mhm,
at a community, say a folk dance, or and I'm using like the basic terms of like a farming community of like where people get together and
right,
have those opportunities. So that would assist in the maintenance of the language outside of Hungary if they had those opportunities. Whereas I
mhm,
imagine in a more city-like situation, you have opportunity for third spaces and third places to convene with other people and
mhm,
but not necessarily with people that speak the same language because it's
right.
such a multitude of languages. And I know, which is a topic for another time, on third places and third spaces and the lack thereof in, current times and how that affects our society. But I imagine that connects to why rural communities in the US maintained their language more so than other communities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you looked in the 1990s in the Pittsburgh area, uh, Hungarians got together in Hungarian clubs in bigger
Hmm.
places, or in smaller places, usually, church basement. So
Right.
churches became very important community
Right.
organizing spaces.
Right. Those third
Yeah.
places or spaces that people
Yeah.
speak of now. It seems to be
Yeah.
a hot topic out there.
Mm,
I imagine in your community as well. But like I listen
yeah.
to a lot of um, podcasts myself. So that's
Right.
a hot term I've been hearing around
Yeah.
the internet. So
And then,
please continue. Yeah.
yeah, just very quickly, I want to mention two more factors. One
Sure.
is something that you already mentioned, and that is marriage patterns. For the
Yeah.
sociolinguist or the sociologist, that's
Hmm.
endogamy versus exogamy. Endogamy is marrying within your group,
Right.
whatever is, your group. That
Sure.
could be a linguistic community, an ethnic community, that could be a religious community. I mean, think about how in earlier times, some parents were very particular about, oh, we are Catholics, you shouldn't be marrying a Protestant,
Right.
etc. So
Exactly.
that's
Sure.
in group or outside the in group. And marriage patterns, I mean, parents are very often right about that marriage patterns define what happens to a new family. Like, for instance,
Sure.
in terms of Hungarians, when the children of immigrants married other children of immigrants of the
Hmm.
same community,
Right.
that allowed their children to grow up speaking at least a little bit of Hungarian.
Right.
Whereas if they married outside the Hungarian community, that was probably not the case.
Right. And two factors related to that would be if they married someone that was Hungarian and they had that opportunity to continue the language, were they
Mhm.
also part of a Hungarian community that sent their kids
Exactly.
to the Hungarian church? Did they attend the athletic club? Did they go to Saturday Hungarian school as such?
Did they do
So,
Boy Scouts
right,
or
exactly. The scouts.
scouting?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
because
Like to have those
scouting.
opportunities.
Absolutely. Scouting became a very, very important sort of institution, if you like, of language maintenance.
Sure.
And I remember meeting young kids back in the 1990s who were in the Scouts, and their Hungarian was remarkably much better than the Hungarian of
Oh,
those
I imagine.
American
Yeah,
Hungarian
no, I
young
imagine.
people who didn't.
I feel
Yeah.
like I'm a product of like my dad didn't marry a Hungarian. My
Hmm.
mom's not Hungarian. And then
Hmm.
I also saw like I'm just throwing out the shift between my brother and I are 5 years apart. So,
Hmm.
and my parents also divorced. So we're adding a lot of variables to this equation. And I noticed because I was firstborn and I was around my grandparents and my dad who were speaking over me all the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And then my brother came along 5 years later and my parents divorced like shortly within a few years of that.
Hmm.
And like there was throughout my youth, I can say,
Hmm.
like I could see the difference. Like I knew more Hungarian, I knew more songs, I knew more words, and just even being exposed to
Right,
the Hungarian food. So like there's so many layers when you
right,
speak of this marriage that affects like the language maintenance or even the cultural
right,
maintenance. So
right.
so
You might be surprised that people, I mean, linguists who deal with bilingualism and bilingualism in the family and in communities, we
mhm.
know that birth order in the family is
Yeah,
very much, very important,
important.
and
Absolutely.
defines to a great extent whether a kid grows up speaking the minority language or not speaking it. And I mean, in any family, the first child uh, has the opportunity to talk to their parents, and if
Hmm.
their parents speak Hungarian, they
Yeah,
will that child will speak Hungarian quite a bit. And then any younger sibling who is born into the family does not just talk to the parents, but to the older siblings. And
right.
if the older sibling is attending school, they will be bringing English into the family. And so the kids start this pattern of speaking English to each other much earlier than otherwise would
Right.
have been.
I'm fascinated by all these topics. Like I've definitely only scratched the surface of
Mm,
what you have studied throughout your career, but I've always been very interested. I read a lot of books that are related to these topics where people talk about third places and language and um, birth order. So I've always been
mhm.
fascinated by this information. So it
Yeah.
really does affect all of the language maintenance as
Hmm.
you've been researching.
Yeah. Yeah, and the last factor I want to mention is what sociolinguists call institutional support, and that is
Okay.
basically the support that groups, especially minority groups, receive from the state.
Okay.
And if you look around in the US, there is definitely not much of that.
Hmm.
For instance, education has pretty much never been funded by the state in any other language but English.
Correct.
The US passed the Bilingual Education Act in 1968,
Hmm.
which was definitely too little, too late for the Hungarian communities because
Sure.
their children were grown up and out of school by then. And so, if there was any Hungarian schools, that was always dependent on the financial support of the community itself. And
Right.
the Hungarian communities being mostly working class communities in the formerly industrial regions of the US, that was always very, very difficult.
Right. Yeah, I imagine that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The same goes for any other institutions, like cultural institutions or radio stations or
Hmm.
anything. I mean, that has always been functioning because of the support of the communities themselves rather than outside support from the state or the federal government.
Right. There's so
And
many layers to everything that
yeah.
you're discussing. I grew up adjacent to a Hungarian community. And when I say adjacent, like I grew up in the community for a
Mhm.
little while. Again, I didn't have a Hungarian mom. So there was that a little bit of disconnect. But I understand what you're saying because at one point in the community where I grew up and then adjacent to it, on the next town over, there was a Hungarian radio station.
Mhm.
There was a butcher shop, the bakery, and there's still other entities, Hungarian entities, the Scouts and
Mhm.
church and the
Mhm.
athletic club. So they're all still there, but they've also suffered a lot of the consequences of the things that you've been saying as far as, you know, did you marry a Hungarian? Did your job take you somewhere further outside the community where it's a little too far to drive the kids to
Mhm.
scout lessons and, Hungarian lessons and scout groups and the
Right.
folk dance. And, that over the decades has spread out. Like when you throw a pebble in the water and you see the rings just start to move out. So I've seen it firsthand. I've been part of it also.
Mhm.
So I feel a lot of that affected me. And I imagine the people listening to this episode as well are making those connections and wondering, where do I fall in
Mhm.
that layer, that pebble? Like, am I close to the center where the pebble was dropped, or how many rings out am I? So
Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating.
And actually, I just remember that there's one more factor that I should mention, and that is what sociolinguists call language attitudes. And
Okay.
language attitudes are basically, the individual's way of looking at things, at the world, and deciding, what they wanted to pass on to their children. For instance, there's a huge difference between some of the 56 immigrants. I've met here people here in Morgantown whose father was a 1956 immigrant, and that father came to the United States. He married a Hungarian American woman who
Hmm.
was born in West Virginia and spoke Hungarian. But then the father decided that, I mean, his experience was so traumatic leaving Hungary that he decided that, okay, we're in the US and we should speak English. And that's what he instilled in his sons, that,
Yeah.
we're in the US, you should be American, you should become Americans, you should be speaking English. And he never taught his kids Hungarian
Yeah.
versus some other 56 immigrants regarded their Hungarian heritage and linguistic heritage as very, very important, and some of them taught their children very good Hungarian, and some of those children are now back in Hungary, for some time or even permanently, and the fact that they speak Hungarian was basically determined by their parents' attitudes.
Yeah, I completely have seen examples of
Hmm.
both of those things. I've
Hmm.
experienced examples of my grandmother and my dad also having traumatic experiences, leaving. And
Right.
also historically at the time, which I know I've touched upon with some other guests about, depending on your experience of leaving Hungary and the time you left
Mhm.
historically really affects your attitude on
Right.
whether you're teaching your kids like you're saying, and or whether you want to visit. And personally, I know my dad had a pretty tragic experience when he was leaving because he was 7, 8, 9 by the time he got here, because there was like about a year
Mhm.
before they
Mhm.
made it from the Austrian refugee camp to Camp
Right.
Kilmer in the New Jersey area. And I mean, he's passed, but he never, ever, ever, ever spoke about his life in Hungary,
Mhm.
because he was a child. He had friends and he went to school. Never, not one story. My
Right.
grandmother, on the other hand, was very positive about her life, even though she grew up in a time where she was a teenager during World War II, hiding in the barn as troops would
Mhm.
come through,
Mhm.
and very positive of just about her experience and her life and her family. So I knew so much about it because of her attitude, but because she left under a traumatic experience, because being a very typical Hungarian woman, she likes to feed people. She was feeding revolutionary soldiers.
Mhm.
Therefore, her name was on the list. Again, that's a story
Right.
for a different episode. But that attitude towards it, when, all of the regime changes were happening in 89 and 90, and I was an older teenager, and I was like, oh my goodness, we could go back. I'm so excited because I knew so
Mhm.
much. Being the
Right.
firstborn, she told me all the stories, and she's like, no, I can never go back because of, she was afraid. So like
Right.
all the things that you're saying are really tying a lot of my experiences into a nice little package.
Mhm.
And I imagine other people out there, when they think of the stories that their parents or grandparents or great grandparents told them, have similar feelings and emotions about some of the words that you're using, like the attitude towards your language and why and time periods. It really does affect how you
Right.
go forward and like where you live, and do you maintain the language and
Yeah.
just all
Yeah.
of that. You researched in the Appalachian region. So tell us a little bit more about that. You said you did cemetery research. So wherever you want to begin with that, please.
Yeah, so well, West Virginia used to have a pretty large influx or communities of immigrants, but that was a long time ago, basically in the 1920s and 30s,
Yeah.
maybe the 1940s, and most of the Hungarians who were here in West Virginia were working in the coal mines. So I mean,
Okay.
this is a major coal mining region, as we all know, and and then with the collapse of the coal mining or the coal industry, a lot of those Hungarians moved to Ohio, moved up to Pennsylvania, and went somewhere else. So, and only sort of small pockets of Hungarians remained. Like, for instance, if you look at it today in West Virginia, in the past, in the latest census, there were 123 people who professed to be speaking Hungarian in the entire state of like 3 million people.
Oh, wow.
But there are hundreds of thousands of people who have Hungarian heritage, okay, and
Right.
Hungarian ancestry, but the communities are definitely not there. Anyway, so in a contest like this, I thought, okay, one thing I can do as a sociolinguist is go to the cemeteries and photograph gravestones of Hungarians and then analyze it for what sociolinguists call the linguistic landscape of
Okay.
cemeteries. And the linguistic landscape is a pretty hot topic of research these days. It entails photographing signage, that is, inscriptions in public places and in contexts where more than one language is used, and then analyzing those inscriptions. Like, for instance, if you find a bilingual street sign or a bilingual poster, is all the information conveyed in both languages, or is the use of one language only symbolic?
Okay.
Uh, if you have it in both, if you have all the information in both languages, is it all conveyed in the same font, same size font, or not? What comes first? What comes second? And a sociolinguist would draw all sorts of conclusions from those little details. And so analyzing the linguistic landscape basically requires the sociolinguist to take photos of all these bilingual signs or inscriptions, and then seeing what we can see and what kind of conclusions can be drawn from that. So what I've done in the past few months is I visited actually 25 cemeteries where Hungarians are buried,
Okay.
and I photographed gravestones. And these cemeteries are, some of them were in southern West Virginia, like places like Gary, West Virginia, Thorpe, West Virginia, Pocahontas, Virginia, which is just across the state line from West Virginia. We also went to Butte, Kentucky, which is this very, very interesting former settlement of Hungarians. It's just across the state line into Kentucky from western West Virginia, and it used to be called Himmlerville, Kentucky,
Okay.
uh, which was actually founded by a Hungarian Jewish immigrant by the name of Martin Himmler. And he bought a mine in that area and then started inviting Hungarian miners to form a Hungarian community. And his emphasis was on, building a Hungarian community. At one point, there were like over 1,000 Hungarians living there, and this was in the 1920s, beginning with like 1920 until about 1928. They had this thriving community of Hungarians, which then was well, basically wiped out by a big flood. This is in one of those hollers
Mhm.
that a flash flood came and destroyed the houses of the miners. But this was a very interesting community because it was the only cooperatively owned mine in the history of mining in the United States.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. And this
Yeah.
is exactly why my historian colleagues are interested in it, because it's a very remarkable fact as far as US labor history is concerned. And unlike in a lot of the other mining or coal towns, there was no script system. They in
Mhm.
Himmerville, everyone earned dollars and
Right.
had their community stores and were co-owners of the mine.
Right.
Anyway, Himmlerville collapsed because of the floods and also because of some maybe not so fortunate financial decisions by
Mhm.
the people who ran it.
Okay.
But it's this very interesting community, or former community, I should say. And then I also went to a lot of places in northern West Virginia and the Morgantown area, like in Shinston and Fairmont, Enterprise, and then in southern West, no, southwestern Pennsylvania. Like I went back to the Pittsburgh area, in West Mifflin, Duquesne, and then also up to the Johnstown area, which
Okay.
had lots of mining towns like Vintondale and Portage and Connellsville, Hooversville. Anyway, so these are the places I went to, and
So approximately how many gravestones do you think that you took pictures of in this research?
well, I have over 3,000
Wow.
pictures. So,
Okay.
and some of them are dual gravestones with husband and wife or
Hmm.
siblings. So I would say around probably the graves of 3,500 people.
Well,
One
that's a
five.
lot of people. So
Yeah.
what did you learn from the linguistic landscape of these headstones that you took pictures of?
Yeah, so I'm very far from having analyzed everything that I found, but my first impressions and first findings are definitely that up until or through the 1930s, most of the gravestone inscriptions were in Hungarian, and they were very, very unique. I mean, individual with lots of Hungarian text, like for instance, Itt nyugszik so and so, so here lies so and so, and then their full dates of birth and death, and then even a message like nyugodjon békében, like rest in peace, or even much more intricate things, details about their lives and things.
I have a question about that. Do you
Mhm.
feel that that's a parallel to what gravestones are like in Hungary, and they were recreating like what gravestones are like in Hungary because they maybe might have been first generation? Is that a connection
Yes, I
there?
think so. I think so.
Okay.
Definitely that the sort of set phrases are definitely,
Okay.
like it would be or would have been in Hungary. Uh, Also, the Hungarian name order was very,
Mm,
very
hmm.
frequent still. So Kovács
Oh,
János rather than János Kovács.
right.
Uh, and a lot of the names were the Hungarian versions of first names, like János rather than John.
Hmm.
And yeah, so definitely lots and lots of Hungarian use of Hungarian. Interestingly, the date formats were predominantly English, like
Okay.
December 23rd, 1930, rather than 1930, December 23rd, which would have been
Right.
Hungarian.
Right. It was probably easier to maintain that part of like the
Mhm.
language, but
Mm.
yet the numbers when you're in the US, you have to adjust to that because
Right,
paychecks
right,
and just all the things in everyday life, you that would
right.
make sense that it was more Americanized with that. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And then beginning with the 1940s, uh, there's a dramatic change and first of all the gravestones became much more uniform
Okay.
and much less text on them, and whatever the text was mostly in English, like rest in peace or here lies, and no additional text. um, the names are in the American order, and more of the first names are Americanized, like Frank rather than Ferenc,
Right.
Steve rather than István, and uh, and then the use of Hungarian from the late 1930s, early 1940s is becomes basically symbolic,
Okay.
is
Yeah.
what I found in these communities which are long gone.
Right.
And
So you basically are saying that that's where the shift started to occur in those
yes.
decades right there.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I could not notice that this shift coincided, excuse me, with the decades when World War II was happening,
Yeah.
and my what I think at the moment, and this might change. I mean, I've been thinking about this a long time now, but yeah. So what I think now is that probably the fact that the U.S. entered the Second World War, and this was, of course, a big event that brought people together and made them think about, that their country is the US and they are Americans. I think that had an effect on what people put on their loved ones' gravestones.
Yeah, I completely agree. Not that I'm a,
Mm,
not that I'm a professor of history, but having been involved in education for so long, I feel like that time period was a
mm.
shift in American pride. You
Right,
saw everything,
right.
even during the war, people got together to support the war effort, donating certain medals and things so for the war effort and just the immense pride and so many people were drafted and families and it was just that time even though it was tragic it was a time of togetherness so I could see how you
Mhm.
would be able to make that connection
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
shifting of the linguistic landscape of the cemetery
exactly.
yeah it's crazy when you learn new things. You
Mm,
could everything is really connected in life throughout
yeah.
history. So that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. So what I think now is that before the First World War, the immigrants and their children were looking at themselves as immigrants, and in
Right.
that sense, sort of Hungarians first.
Yeah.
And they made an effort to put Hungarian on their gravestones. And then, beginning with the Second World War, they started looking at themselves as Hungarian Americans.
Yeah.
Some definitely a big emphasis on them being Americans,
Yeah, that makes a lot of
and that
sense.
brought about the change of language.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your research clearly is I know you said you haven't finished analyzing it all, but you could definitely
Mhm.
see that's where it's headed with your
Yeah,
findings.
yeah.
That's pretty exciting. Now, was there anything else like linguistic tendencies that you saw through these cemetery photos?
Well, one thing is a curious thing, and I don't think it has very much to do with society or language, but has everything to do with, well, economic factors such as the price of gravestones and
Yeah.
inscriptions. That these days, I mean, if you go to an American cemetery, and I've been to all of these recently, I mean, you find very minimalistic inscriptions on the gravestones, and I was really surprised by that. And then I consulted a few people who I thought, would have insight into that, and they told me that the reason was very simple, that the more text you put on a gravestone, the more expensive that is.
That makes sense.
And,
Yeah.
and that drives a lot of the, well, what shall we put on the gravestone kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Like the economy behind it, which is
Exactly.
pretty interesting.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And for instance, in one of the cemeteries in West Virginia that I went to, I saw the grave of a Protestant minister who used Hungarian until the end of his life. He was a 1956 immigrant,
Mhm.
and even and he, preached in Hungarian and in English to mostly Hungarian congregations, and even he did not have anything else on his gravestone, just his full name, full dates of birth
Mhm.
and death, and that's it.
That's
And-
pretty
and-
interesting. That
yeah,
I guess it's really just the price factor, especially with the economy throughout, the decades. It costs a lot to make a gravestone,
Right.
even in today's standards. But also too now, I don't know much about creating headstones. In the past, is it possible that family members would carve their own back in time, back in history, and then once it became a job and a business and people were
Mhm.
charged for it, that shift also economically
Exactly.
would affect
Exactly.
how many words that they're putting on a gravestone. So,
Exactly. Like in some of the oldest Hungarian cemeteries in southern West Virginia, I definitely saw several, um, if you like, not very professionally carved gravestones. So it
right,
looked like, the people or
right.
the bodies of the person who died did it themselves. So it was
Okay.
definitely not a commercial enterprise,
Yeah.
but the Hungarian was completely intact. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. Well, it makes a lot of sense, just
Hmm.
historically and also economically why these things happened. Now, you also mentioned that part of your research was you've interviewed people in the area. So,
Yes.
and you mentioned also before too that only was it 123 or 126 people actually speak
In the
Hungarian?
state of West Virginia,
Right, that's
according
like
to
a
the last
drop of
census.
in the bucket, like just one water drop in the bucket. Tell us a little bit about those interviews and specifically like what questions were you asking
Mhm.
these Hungarian descendants? Like what were you looking to glean from their family experiences?
Well, I was interested in finding out, how they speak about their Hungarian heritage. So I always began by asking them, who among their ancestors came to the United States and when and where
Right.
they settled and what they did for a living, and sort of
Mhm.
asked them whether they heard Hungarian spoken around them when they were growing up, whether they could understand some of it. So I did ask about language use in the family, but it was completely clear that these were most of these people, almost all of them, were monolingual English
Okay.
speakers who did not
Right.
speak any Hungarian. Um, yeah, so what I found, and again, this is very preliminary, very cursory observations. So that definitely the food was a big organizing principle that brought Hungarianness in their lives, and even those interviewees who did not speak any Hungarian otherwise remembered several names of Hungarian dishes that their grandmas and in some cases moms made, like cabbage noodles, kapustás kocka, and
Right.
uh, you know
Probably like chicken paprikash, things like that. Yeah.
definitely chicken
Yeah.
paprika.
And like
Yeah,
a
and
goulash maybe. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and things like
Yeah. So it's amazing that like food, because I've talked about food on the podcast with many people. Food
mm,
is really a big connector
mhm,
in maintaining, I don't want to use the word connection again, but maintaining your heritage, whether it's Hungarian or not. Food is a big variable in that
Yeah,
equation.
definitely.
Even if you haven't even been around people in your family that have spoken Hungarian or you haven't heard Hungarian, the food is still there.
Yeah, and then other things that people mentioned, and this was true, especially of people of Hungary of working class background, that what they learned from their grandmas and grandpas is sort of this very um, strong attitude to life, in that about resilience and the work ethic
Yeah,
and perseverance, which are basically, I mean, let's face it, they are not necessarily just Hungarian values.
sure.
They're just,
Yeah.
you know, very important values in any case. And so in their cases, it was not so much the ethnic um, values that I could hear people talking about, but just instilling very important basic values.
Basic, yeah, yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like I definitely feel that with my own
Mm.
experience as well. And also, too, you could connect that to the reasons why many people, not just Hungarians, immigrate to the United States
Yes.
because they're
Mm.
leaving either a political or unfortunate economic situation. So clearly, like perseverance, being a hard worker would be
Mhm.
important. And if we look at the reasons, as we've discussed before when we talked about Hungarian roots and American dreams, a lot of people had stories of when they came over, they were coming over to the United States because of those reasons. Therefore,
Right.
perseverance and being a hard worker would be an important characteristic to have in your life.
Mhm.
So it's nice to hear that even though people don't speak and they don't maybe have that cultural connection of knowing how to do the chardash or speak the language, that they have those other characteristics of being a hard worker.
Yeah, yeah, and then there's one thing I'd like to mention, and
Sure.
this concerns my own outlook on Hungarians and Hungarianness, and I had to like drastically change it over the past few months,
Oh,
and
I'm excited to hear this.
yeah, and that has to do with the definition of who is Hungarian. And
Ooh.
this is a question that I had to think about very, very actively as I was roaming these cemeteries, taking pictures of the Hungarian
Okay. Yeah.
gravestones. Because, whenever I went to a cemetery that was defined in its name as, Hungarian Reformed Cemetery of such and such place,
Right.
just photographed all the gravestones, and I didn't have to make a decision. But
Yeah.
then other cemeteries where I knew that there were many Hungarian gravestones, um, I had to make a decision. Okay, so who is Hungarian? And obviously, if the name was in any way Hungarian, like Ferenc or István was
Sure.
um, on the gravestone, that's I took them to be Hungarian. But then, even when it came to like last names, it much more difficult because okay, a Kovács could be a Hungarian or it could be a Croat, for
Right.
instance, Catholic cemetery. And the fact that if their name is spelled with the Hungarian CS at the end, that
Hmm.
could be because they were Hungarian or because they came from Austria-Hungary, where the administration was done in Hungarian, and therefore their last name
Hmm.
would be spelled in the Hungarian fashion,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And there are some last names which could be, I mean, even with the same spelling, could be Hungarian or Slovak. Like, for instance, Bodnar. Bodnar is actually a Rusin word that is spelled with a diacritic over the A in Slovak and Hungarian, but not in Rusin. So,
Okay.
whether that person is Hungarian is anyone's good guess. And then, there's a multitude of German and Slavic last names in Hungary
Hmm.
itself. And those people are, of course, identify as Hungarians. Um, Now, if you take, for instance, in a Catholic cemetery, uh, last names that are Slavic, well, is that a Hungarian person with a Slavic name, or is that a truly a Slavic person? And that's a decision that you have to make, as you walk past. Okay, do I take a picture of this gravestone or not? So I took pictures of the names that were definitely spelled in the Hungarian fashion, but of course I don't necessarily know whether that person was Hungarian or not. And
Okay.
it drove the point to home to me that in the United States, the last names are definitely not the only and probably not the most important bit of information that
Right.
indicates the Hungarian.
Okay. So prior to you taking pictures and interviewing people, that was a deciding factor that you relied on as evidence. And then
Yeah,
afterwards, you questioned that. So,
absolutely.
well, that makes a lot.
Absolutely.
As an American born, an American citizen, my Hungarian last name wouldn't present to you
Mm,
as Hungarian because it's Obendorfer. So that could
right,
be
right.
Austrian or German. There's a town, Oberndorf.
Mhm,
So
right.
so clearly there's roots there. However, my grandfather was born in Budapest. So,
Mhm.
and so was his mom. But I guess it's really, you have to maybe look deeper when you're looking at last names in the US compared to when you're in Hungary. What determinations have you made with that? Like, or if you haven't done that yet, what are you looking to assess in your research with that information?
Well, I mean, currently my standpoint is that as long as there is any true indication of the person being Hungarian in the use of Hungarian on the gravestone
Okay.
or in the first name form, like Ferenc rather
Mhm.
than Frank, I mean, I take that as a indication that the person was most likely Hungarian. But for the rest, it's really not so easy.
Yeah,
And I would not want to hazard guesses that have, very important implications. And so if I make the wrong guess, that gives me an incorrect conclusion at the end of the
right.
research.
Right. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay. So tell me a little bit more about some of the things that you asked the people that you interviewed. Like, what were some other things that you learned?
Hmm. Well, people who grew up with Hungarians around them, like their grandparents or aunts and uncles, I asked them about whether they did things differently than other families who were not Hungarians.
Mm.
And some people mentioned, Christmas celebrations of Christmas, like for instance, whether uh, Christmas Eve was a big deal or not such a big deal, and when they opened presents and things like that, because I mean most Hungarians in Hungary
Right,
traditionally presents on Christmas Eve.
right.
But,
So now what's next? So you have this information that you've acquired through your research about this Appalachian region of
hmm,
with Hungarian descendants. What would one do, such as yourself, with this Fulbright research? What happens
mhm.
now with that research? What's the next step when something like this happens for someone doing research?
Well, I'm an academic first and foremost, and so what I will be doing is publishing the results of my research
Right.
and sociolinguistics journals. Hopefully, maybe a monograph will come out of it, and
Mm.
I think that's also very, very important. I mean, even though, if you take the whole population, very few people read academic publications, but it's still very important because that's how knowledge is passed on, and
Absolutely.
especially scholarly knowledge is passed on. So definitely that. But if I also, if I then put on my other hat as the co-editor of these books of Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, I definitely met several people who have very, very interesting stories to tell about their family history. And I have invited several of them to become authors on the next volume that Réka Bakos and I will be editing very soon. We actually started on the volume already, and we'll be editing it in the spring and summer, and hopefully it will come out next fall.
That's exciting.
So
Yeah,
that's definitely one other thing that has come out of
that's pretty
me being
exciting.
here in West Virginia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you have like a lived experience of all of the stories
Yes.
by visiting and interviewing, by visiting cemeteries and interviewing people. Like you're getting
Yeah.
a little bit of a firsthand taste of the stories that people are telling you in these volumes. And if
Definitely.
listening to this episode and you haven't listened to the episode with Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, when I spoke with Anna and Reka about their book, you should definitely go back and listen to that episode. It's episode 1 from season 3. But let's just get back to your research. I have another question. Now, do you feel that you're going to use any of this research when you're teaching any of your classes? And how does that relate to some of the information that maybe you already teach to your students?
Yes, definitely. Well, back in Szeged over the years, I have taught an undergrad seminar to our English and American Studies majors about multilingualism in the United States. That was the name of my seminar, Multilingualism in the United States. And the last topic I always discussed was, after we covered varieties of English and then other languages in the US, like Native American languages and Creoles and then immigrant languages. And the last topic was always American Hungarian. But that was like one class in a university course. Well, now I'm thinking of teaching a course on just American Hungarians and their language use and linguistic heritage, because I feel like I definitely have enough material.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, you have a whole semester's worth of information now, not
Exactly.
just one class. So
Exactly.
I would love to be able to attend a class like that.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if the University of Szeged does online courses. That would be such a great thing. So that sounds like a lot of fun for you. At least you could use your work and your research going forward. And because I'm sure, as a former teacher of English in public schools, you do mix it up a little bit. I was teaching different novels and different stories. The root of what you teach in English in the US schools is the same, but sometimes you want to add new and exciting things to your syllabus for the year. So I imagine this is going to be a nice, fresh addition to all of the things that you teach in your courses. And I'm sure the students will be excited to hear about that as well. It's certainly been an honor to speak to you, Anna, Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, about this research. Also, if you haven't listened to the other episode with Dr. Anna Fenyvesi and Reka Bakos, definitely go back and listen, because we've also had additional episodes where we're interviewing in a co-host situation. So far, we've had 2 with Reka Bakos, where she's my co-host, and we've interviewed people that have submitted their Hungarian American stories of immigration to the book. And Dr. Anna Fenyvesi will also be joining me as my co-host. So I'm so glad that we got to record this episode about your work, because I feel like it will make all the co-host episodes so much more fulfilling, that people have this background knowledge about sociolinguistics and linguistics, and specifically your work about the Appalachian Hungarian Heritage Project, the sociolinguistics of Heritage Hungarian. Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate that you were able to inform us about this great research. I hope people learned a little bit about themselves, and maybe they can make connections as I did as I listened to you. So thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us, and I look forward to more conversations with you going forward.
Well, thank you, Christina. I really, really appreciate having been invited, and this has been a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about the research I'm totally excited about, and I hope that I managed to show your listeners that linguistics is not just this ivory tower activity, but something that has relevance for real life, because it really does. At least sociolinguistics definitely does.
I really feel that people are going to make those personal connections to all the things that you presented today. And actually, one last thing, you'll also be presenting your information at the American Hungarian Educators Association annual meeting, which is being held this year in Pécs. So you'll be presenting 2 topics, your research for this and also with the book. So lots of great things to come from your research and from your book. So thank you so much for sharing that and giving me the opportunity to share that with the listeners. Thank you again.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Christine. Thank you very much.
Here.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. And thanks to Dr. Anna Fenyvesi for sharing her Fulbright research project with us. I hope that you were able to make some sociolinguistic connections to your own family's Hungarian heritage experience. If you're interested in contacting Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, I will leave that information in the show notes. You can also purchase a copy of Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, either in English or in Hungarian, and I will leave that information in the show notes too. If you have feedback or questions about this episode, or you would like to connect with me at the podcast, you will also find that information in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode and you're interested in learning more about this Hungarian heritage community, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Our theme music is Hungarian Dance by Pony Music, used with special license from Envato Market. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, make sure you stay Hungarian Heritage Strong. See you, Stoke!